Prologue. Memories are ghosts. They say you can't remember everything about your childhood. That time erases, distorts, and rearranges what you thought you knew. But some memories are like ghosts. They cling to you, whispering from the shadows of your mind, never really letting go. That's how it is with my sister, Marjorie. I don't just remember her. I relive her. I was 8 years old when everything started to fall apart. It was a time when monsters were still just stories in the books Marjorie would read to me before bed. I didn't know that monsters could be real, or that they could live inside the people you love most. But Marjorie knew. She always knew. Our house on West Elm Street still stands, an old Victorian with a sagging porch and windows that never quite seem to keep out the cold. People drive by now, pointing it out as that house, the one where it happened. They take pictures, some even leaving flowers or trinkets, as if the memories buried there can be appeased with offerings. But the ghosts remain. They always do. Chapter 1. The First Shadows. The year everything changed, Marjorie was 16. She was everything I wanted to be: smart, witty, effortlessly cool. She'd read me horror stories, filling my head with tales of ghouls and ghosts, but she always made them seem fun, a way for us to bond. "Don't worry, Mary," she'd say, tousling my hair. "Monsters can't get us if we stick together." But soon, the monsters became real. It started subtly, like the gentle creak of a door swinging open in an empty room. Marjorie became different. At first, it was just little things. She'd space out, staring at nothing for minutes at a time, her eyes unfocused, her lips moving silently. Then, she'd laugh at things no one else could hear, a strange, forced laugh that would cut off suddenly, leaving her expression blank. Mom and Dad were worried, but they didn't talk about it much, at least not to me. They whispered late at night, their voices tense and hushed. I'd lie in bed, clutching my stuffed rabbit, Mr. Bun, and try to block out their worried murmurs. But it was hard to ignore the growing fear in our house, the way every creak, every shadow seemed to pulse with something unspoken. Then, one evening, I walked into Marjorie's room without knocking. The sun was setting, casting long beams of orange light across her walls. She was sitting on her bed, her back to me, her hair falling over her shoulders. I was about to call her name when I noticed her hands. They were clenched into fists so tight that her knuckles were white, her nails digging into her palms. Her head was tilted, and she was whispering to the wall, her voice low and urgent. "No," she was saying. "I won't do it. You can't make me." I froze, the words catching in my throat. Marjorie's voice didn't sound like her own. It was too deep, too rough, as if something else was speaking through her. "Marjorie?" I whispered. She turned so suddenly that I stumbled back. Her eyes were wide, wild, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. But then her expression softened, and she forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mary," she said, her voice light and airy, but there was a tremor underneath it. "Didn't anyone teach you to knock?" Chapter 2. The Reality Show. Things got worse after that. Marjorie's episodes became more frequent, more frightening. She'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night, her voice echoing through the house, full of a terror that made my skin crawl. She'd thrash and claw at the air, as if fighting off invisible hands, and Mom would hold her, whispering soothing words that never seemed to help. Dad tried to stay logical, clinging to science and reason. He took Marjorie to doctors, psychiatrists, anyone who might have an explanation. They said it was psychosis, schizophrenia, something neurological that could be managed with medication and therapy. But the medicine never seemed to work. Marjorie only got worse. And then came the reality show. It started with a phone call. A production company had heard about our situation, about Marjorie, about the unexplained phenomena in our house, and they wanted to make a documentary. At first, Mom and Dad were horrified by the idea, but as the medical bills piled up and Marjorie's condition worsened, desperation took over. They agreed, hoping that the show might bring awareness, maybe even answers. The crew moved in, setting up cameras in every room, turning our house into a stage. The show was called The Possession, and it was exactly as exploitative as the name suggested. They filmed everything: Marjorie's outbursts, our family arguments, the moments of eerie stillness when the air seemed to hum with something unseen. They edited our fear into a spectacle, something for people to watch and dissect from the comfort of their living rooms. And Marjorie, she hated it. "Don't you see?" she hissed at me one day, her eyes wild, her hands gripping the edges of the kitchen table. "They're watching us. Not just the crew. Them. The ones in the shadows. They love this. They feed on it." I didn't understand what she meant. I was too young, too naive. But I felt the fear in her voice, the desperation that made her seem older and more fragile than she should have been. Chapter 3: The Descent into Madness. The house changed as the show went on. The air grew heavy, thick with tension and something darker, something that clung to your skin and made it hard to breathe. Marjorie's episodes grew more violent. She'd slam her head against the wall, claw her arms until they bled, her screams raw and animalistic. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd sit up in bed, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The cameras never missed a thing. One evening, I sat on the stairs, watching the crew set up in the living room. Marjorie was there, slouched on the couch, her hair hanging over her face. The producer, a man named Ken, was asking her questions, trying to draw out the drama. He leaned forward, his tone almost taunting. "Marjorie," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "do you think you're possessed?" She lifted her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. There was something in her gaze, something that made my heart pound, made my mouth go dry. Her lips curled into a small, twisted smile. "Do you?" she whispered. Ken shifted uncomfortably, but he kept the smile plastered on his face. "That's not the question, is it? We want to know what you think." Marjorie's smile widened, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that still managed to fill the room. "They're here, you know," she said, her eyes flicking to the shadows that gathered in the corners. "They're watching you, too." The lights flickered, just for a moment, and the air seemed to grow colder. Ken laughed it off, but I saw the way his hand trembled as he adjusted his microphone. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Marjorie's madness, or her truth. Chapter 4: The Exorcism. Things reached a breaking point when a priest was brought in. Father Wanderley was an older man, his hair gray, his eyes weary. He looked like someone who had seen too much, who carried the weight of his faith like a burden. He agreed to perform an exorcism, though he warned us that it was a last resort, that it was dangerous, both spiritually and psychologically. The exorcism took place in Marjorie's room. The crew filmed from the hallway, their cameras trained on the door, but I stayed inside, pressed against the wall, clutching Mr. Bunn, my knuckles white. Father Wanderley stood at the foot of Marjorie's bed, his Bible in hand, his voice strong as he began to pray. Marjorie lay still, her eyes closed, her body tense. But as the prayer went on, she began to tremble. Her eyes flew open, and she let out a scream that didn't sound human. It was a guttural, raw sound, full of rage and pain, and the room seemed to shake with it. The walls shuddered, the lights flickered, and for a moment, it felt like the whole house was going to collapse. "Stop," Marjorie growled, her voice distorted, layered, like something else was speaking through her. "You're hurting us." Father Wanderley continued, his voice wavering but steady. He sprinkled holy water on her, and she convulsed, her back arching, her fingers clawing at the bed sheets. "Leave this child," he commanded, his voice breaking. "Return to the darkness from which you came." Marjorie's head snapped to the side, and she fixed him with a glare that made my heart stop. Her mouth twisted into a sneer, and she laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. "You can't save her," she whispered. She's already ours. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I screamed, clutching Mr. Bunn to my chest, and the crew outside the door shouted in confusion, their voices mingling with Marjorie's laughter, echoing in the dark. And then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The lights came back on, and Marjorie collapsed onto the bed, limp and silent. Father Wanderley was pale, his hands trembling as he crossed himself, his lips moving in a silent prayer. But Marjorie's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, her mouth still curled into that twisted, unnatural smile. Epilogue: The Ghosts That Remain. The show ended, but our story never really did. The footage aired, and people talked about it, dissected it, argued over whether Marjorie was possessed or just sick. We became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told in living rooms and around campfires. Marjorie never got better. She faded, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left of her. And as for me, I grew up, but I never really escaped the house, the memories, the whispers in the dark. People ask me what I believe. Was Marjorie possessed, or was it all in her head? Was our family torn apart by something supernatural, or was it just tragedy and illness, amplified by the glare of the cameras? I don't have an answer. I only have the memories, the shadows, and the feeling that something never really left. Our house on West Elm Street stands empty now, but I know it's not abandoned. The ghosts are still there. They always are.